The world is never as clear or as concise as we'd like it to be. Sometimes reality denies us the explanations that we desire. Sometimes our human rationalism fails to rationalize what is indeed a chaotic and absurd universe. Kinda like the 1985 Martin Scorsese underrated classic, After Hours, where, things get weird.
Oh, God.
Sometimes, despite us wanting to return to a sane, calm, regulated environment, the world around us just won't cooperate with those standards. Sometimes, even though you think you want to return home, what you really want is more painfully complicated than that. In this attempted explanation of After Hours, things are gonna get strange, and you might just have to push through it until the sun comes up again and the illusion of clarity can be reconciled with. So, Martin Scorsese explains the film in a few ways, but the clearest one for me initially is it's an anxiety dream.
In a way, in a sense, the script really felt like the anxiety dreams that we have.
What starts off as a plausible series of events becomes a truly confusing and terrifying nightmare, all leading to us heading back to our daily normal lives the next day as if nothing even happened, once we crash out, awakened from the horrifying visions. Now, we could just call it a day with that explanation. It's an absurdist comedy set within a spiraling dream where things get progressively worse and worse. But I'm not too satisfied with just that thesis. I'm also not necessarily of the mind that After Hours is one of those films that can be easily explained away with the traditional shot A means this, motif B means this mode of analysis. But screw it, let's try it anyway. After Hours is about how humans, in the world that we live in, are punished for desiring. Not just desiring too much, but wanting a sense of control over their own existence. Humans do not live in an isolated world for the individual. We live in and amongst each other, meaning that in order to live, we must cooperate with each other, even when we don't want to. We can think that our existence is all about ourselves, but in doing that, reality will find ways to punish us for these quote-unquote selfish desires, and make us wish that we never even tried to live freely to begin with.
Hello? Hello? Oh, wow. Oh, wow.
But how do we get there from a silly movie that virtually makes no sense like After Hours? Well, things kinda get a little crazy at night.
Different rules apply when it gets this late, you know what I mean? It's like After Hours.
What exactly happens to Paul Hackett one night is hard to explain simply, but to say that his story fits well into the One Wild Night genre of stories would be an understatement. One evening, after working a job, where, by the way, someone at his workplace details to Paul his plan to escape this word processing work that he finds monotonous and boring. By the way, this opening I think is really important and we will return to it. Paul goes to a diner. There, Paul meets a woman, Marcy, who strikes up conversation with him about the book he's reading. There seems to be some chemistry, and she gives him the opportunity, in a sense, to keep things going.
Well, if you think you might be interested, our number's 243-3460.
243-3460. Okay.
She offers him the chance to get an artisan-crafted bagel paperweight from this artist she knows, in what seems like what is really a means of meeting up at an apartment to continue their interactions. So far, all seems relatively normal, until, while on the way over in a crazy fast taxicab, the $20 bill that Paul had intended to carry him throughout the night blows out of the car window. And yeah, I mean, $20 for the whole night? Yeah, this is clearly the 80s. From this point onward, things get extraordinarily weirder and weirder, and more drastically terrible for Paul. This marks arguably the first external restriction of autonomy for Paul, a punishment of sorts, for daring to experiment and live freely without regimented planning. Marcy is not initially at the loft apartment, leaving Paul to deal with Kiki, the artist who is creating this sculpture out of what looks like paper mache, and Paul briefly compares it to the legendary painting, The Scream.
It reminds me of that Edvard Munch painting. Was it the Shriek?
Scream.
Kiki, while waiting for Marcy, makes several requests, almost like demands of Paul, which he obliges. She takes away his shirt, which he never gets back by the way, and gives him a different shirt, though the new shirt is admittedly nicer. Yet another small few things taken from Paul's autonomy, but at this point, it doesn't seem like that big a deal. Once Marcy arrives, Paul and her move into her room, but Paul's initial advancements aren't reciprocated exactly as planned. Marcy's behavior becomes erratic and unpredictable, and she reveals a series of unexpected things about her life to Paul, all leading him to getting scared and abandoning her. Of course, it's raining, and on that very night, the subway fare has been raised higher than he can afford at the time. Well, probably because now he's effectively broke. He runs into a nearby bar, and from there, still can't seem to catch a break, as the waitress is creepily enamored with him and the bartender can't even open his register to help him take out some train fare. The bartender lends Paul his keys to go to his apartment to grab the keys to the register, while subsequently learning about a rampant issue of break-ins throughout the neighborhood, putting everyone around on edge. Trading his keys with the bar owners as a sense of insurance, Paul does as instructed. Just as he's about to return, he notices what looks like Cheech and Chong stealing Kiki's sculpture. So, acting on his own accord rather than minding his own business, Paul spooks the supposed muggers and brings the sculpture back, only to find out those people had fairly taken the sculpture and Kiki's old TV. Then, in another further horrifying twist, Kiki's guest tells Paul that he needs to apologize to Marcy for leaving her, but Paul discovers that Marcy overdosed on sleeping pills and took her own life, seemingly because of the bad interaction she had with Paul. Paul reports the death to the authorities, but then finds himself initially unable to escape the room. He foolishly leaves again, now only to find that the bartender has temporarily closed the bar, leaving him outside with Julie, who is proving to be even weirder than first thought. In order to escape the rain and to wait for the bar owner to return, he stays with the incredibly forward Julie at her place for a little bit. After getting his hand stuck in her hair and the bar owner thankfully returning, Paul heads back to the bar owner. But as it happens, this bartender is Marcy's boyfriend, and he finds out via phone that Marcy killed herself.
My girlfriend just killed herself.
Returning briefly to Julie's, she reveals that she actually owns and wants to give him one of Kiki's bagel paperweights. Another strange coincidence that doesn't really go anywhere. Paul, rather than following along out of weird fear, I guess, rejects her and the paperweight, leading to him getting the heck out of there and trying to find Kiki and her intimidating boyfriend at Club Berlin, where Kiki's note she left indicated they would be. In trying to tell Kiki that Marcy killed herself, the nightclub bouncer forces Paul to get a mohawk haircut, but Paul escapes with just a small amount of his hair clipped off, and never able to communicate anything to Kiki. More instances of Paul's autonomy being challenged and restricted over and over, and we aren't even done yet. Paul meets yet another random lady who operates an ice cream truck, and yet again is tormented by her strange antics after she offers to help him.
5, 8, 6, 2,
Don't.
9,
Don't.
3, 8, 0.
All of this after Paul took that $20 bill off of the returned statue, all to have the burned cab driver take it from him without driving him anywhere. Gail, this new woman, sees posters that claim that Paul is the community burglar, all made by Julie falsely accusing him of such out of revenge, and launches an all-out community assault on Paul, where residents are up in arms over these accusations. Paul, now running for his life, is informed of a secret gallery exhibition at Club Berlin, so he takes refuge there, and to his surprise, there's almost no one there, except for a barkeep and yet another mysterious woman. Paul, out of a new sense of desperation, dances with this woman and pleads with her that he just wants to live.
I want
To live.
It's not long before the angry mob somehow tracks down Paul, leading to this woman named June to hide Paul in her apartment that's in the basement of Club Berlin. June hides Paul by virtually turning him into another papier-mâché statue, and the angry mob gives up their search for Paul. June leaves briefly, and Paul's statue hiding spot is stolen by Cheech and Chong, put in the back of their van, and just as the sun is rising, falls out of the back, breaks into pieces, and leaves Paul in front of his workplace, wherein which Paul gets up and goes back to work. What a horrifyingly hilarious spiral of events for Paul, where at basically every turn he's put into some new uncomfortable scenario and punished even worse for abandoning it. A common reading of this film is that it's about emasculation, as almost all the female characters emasculate Paul in different ways. And of course there's that iconic wall graffiti that Paul sees, along with some vague lines about castration said by Marcy earlier on.
So I just broke the whole thing off.
But I feel like that's only one piece of the puzzle, and emasculation doesn't necessarily cover things as well as the removal of autonomy does. Did the cab driver really emasculate Paul by taking away his $20? Did the barbers emasculate Paul by taking off a chunk of his hair? I think the answer is more complicated than just the typical Freudian castration-related fears. Some say it's a mouse escaping a labyrinth, some say it's about death, and Paul has simply entered the underworld and is experiencing the mania of hell. Others say it's a city-based Wizard of Oz. After all, the Wizard of Oz is mentioned.
The Wizard of Oz. He talked about it constantly.
All pretty valid takes on the film, I suppose. Another interpretation could also very well be the film being about the fear of the working man being or becoming homeless. Paul is put in a scenario wherein which he no longer has the money to afford services, goods, and safety, and is constantly shown wishing he could return home.
Would you just give me a break? I really just want to go home.
Running away from dicey scenario to dicey scenario, tired of being unable to afford a way out of precariousness. With eventually society turning against him for simply attempting to exist and persecuting him, assuming that he is the criminal robbing properties in question. To Paul, the working man's greatest nightmare would be to be beholden to strangers and have virtually no agency because you got no money. So, it's about homelessness. I think. I mean, it's just one part of the lack of agency angle. It's the world of people, not operating by rules that Paul wants to operate by. For a second, let's go back to the very start of the movie, where Paul is talking to that guy who wants to get out of the job that Paul is training him for. This period of time is during work hours, where the rules of engagement are clear, yet this guy wants to pursue something more grand than what Paul is accepting of, and Paul simply doesn't care for it. Paul couldn't care less for these ideas, as he just wants to fit his role and do what he does. And if he never struck up that conversation with Marcy, none of this craziness would have happened. But he decided to live a little more dangerously. He decided to take a bit of a risk. But the world is often unkind to those who take risks, especially for their own potential pleasure, and many are often denied the success they'd like to befall them. And Paul is certainly denied any and all forms of pleasure, and he's practically given opportunities to get alternative versions of what he originally wanted, but abandoning those opportunities further leads Paul to greater and greater punishments. This is how the film warns viewers, to show that a desperate attempt to retreat from challenges or difficult situations will really only make things worse. Paul only wanted to make progress when it came to his own betterment, rather than trying to think about other people, the other people that he was in fact interacting with. Unknowingly, his sole focus on his own safety and security is what leads to an angry mob of people chasing him, combing the streets. Perhaps if at any particular point, Paul simply dealt with the situation rather than run away when the going got hard, things could have gone much better for him. His inability to adopt and change is what leads to the world crumbling around him and coming after him with violent vigor. Maybe if Paul saw further beyond his 9-to-5 job and overall cozy but ultimately unfulfilling life, something new and better could emerge. But something new and better can't emerge without challenges, and the desire to simply run away from said challenges would never get him anywhere. And thus, in the time outside of his occupation, Paul is aimless and set on a course for self-destruction, no matter how good his intentions may be. That's what After Hours is about, at least in my opinion. The world becomes a fever dream if you're afraid to take risks and pay the consequences. Because, who knows, maybe the consequences of inaction and fear could be a whole lot worse.
Let me out of this thing. Now. Do you hear me? Let me out.
Lack of discipline.